dynasty who had guarded the royal family in Moscow and the Kremlin, but he didn't want them to, let's say, keep him a prisoner in his own palace. And at one point in 1689, he put down a revolt and had over 1,000 of them executed to affirm his control over the empire. And he became the greatly feared, the great Peter. His ambition was to expand even the empire to include more lands and more commerce and such. So he went on a series of military campaigns, first of all fighting the Swedes that they defeated in 1709 at Poltava, and gathered much more territory, including Poland and all the way down to the Black Sea, and this extended the Russian military campaign all the way to be butting heads sometimes with the Ottoman Empire and, of course, all of the borders of the West. But that's when Königsberg there and Prussia was taken by the Russians, and other battles all up and down. The Baltics were taken. And so he oversaw the expansion to the west of the Russian Empire. In the history, though, he was insistent on the discipline of his troops, and so here is a romantic painting of him coming in and stopping his troops from pillaging and raping and all the looting, the usual business of war. So he tried to keep his troops honorable, as it was said, which of course now is, formalized in law these days. But he had trouble at home, and this is another dramatic picture of him accusing his own son Alexei of planning to have a palace revolt. And his son, whether he was actually guilty or not, was put into prison. And he died in prison at the order of his own father, which is not good family relations. And then Peter himself died in 1725, and beside his son and the other royals of the era, they all have a beautiful chapel and tombs in the fortress of Peter and Paul right there in central St. Petersburg. And so I'm sure some of the tourists will go there to see this. Quite a beautiful family tomb. But when Peter died of natural causes, he's an elder, this cartoon was published in St. Petersburg with the mice celebrating the death of the cat. And so Peter the Great had such, let's say, authority that many were happy to see him go and grow their beards again, perhaps. But in Russian history, he's considered the greatest of the emperors, particularly as the royal families tended to have more trouble as time went on. And of course, the last Romanovs were all killed, and the royalty is now done. But Peter is still considered the great builder of the city and the founder of the modern Russian Empire. So there are monuments for him all around St. Petersburg and some in Moscow. But this is his city, and this has always been considered the more enlightened part of the Russian nation. This is right on the Neva River with Peter welcoming the world as they come in. When he died, though, his wife Catherine I ordered a grand monument for him, and as a pedestal, they took this tremendous boulder from the northern lakes and brought it on the ice and dragged it all the way into right where it is today in St. Petersburg on the river to build this great statue for him, an equestrian statue of him all but flying on his horse. And so that's still there, and that's the symbol of St. Petersburg. It's there, we'll go right by it, and you'll see many people around it. But this was designed and then cast by a French artist named Falconet. It took him many castings to get it right, but it's a tremendous piece of bronze. And in Russian literature, it has its role in a Pushkin tale where on the full moon night, the horse and the Peter the Great go chasing his enemies around town in the moonlight, sort of like the legend of Sleepy Hollow. But this is Pushkin, who's the great poet of St. Petersburg, and he wrote about St. Petersburg, the Neva, the river, is clad in granite. Bridges stand poised over her waters. Her islands are covered with dark green gardens now, and before the younger capital of St. Petersburg, the ancient Moscow has paled like a black-clad widow before a new empress. And so Russians are particularly proud of all the architecture and sort of the enlightenment that St. Petersburg has always represented, and for so many years before other transport, going to St. Petersburg was your introduction to Russia. And then the rest was behind. This is St. Isaac's Cathedral right near the statue, right in the center square. There's a controversy currently because the Russian Orthodox Church wants to re-sanctify the church and make it an active church. Right now it's a, let's say, preserved museum of that imperial past, but it's open to the public and they do not have any religious activities in it right now. This is the fortress of St. Peter and Paul, with many rooms and military bastions and things like this. You can go in and walk around in it, and the cathedral is where the royal tombs are. Now this is sort of the, when you come in by sea, this is the first part of St. Petersburg you would see in the olden days. And it was built to make sure that the city was protected, particularly against the archenemy, the Swedes at the time. And, but it's been famous also as a prison, including the son of Peter the Great, Alexei, and many dissidents have always gone there. So it's sort of a mark of your esteem as a dissident that you were imprisoned in this. Most famously, Dostoevsky was imprisoned here. That's the cathedral in the center of the different quarters, and there's no military there anymore. But just these spires alone are quite fantastic, reaching to the sky. And traditionally on a ship, that would be one of the first things you'd see as you were coming into the city. And when it was the commercial capital of Russia, it was very, very busy when all trade was mainly shipborne. This is the Admiralty, which is the Navy headquarters to this day of the Soviet or the Russian Navy, which again is one of these monumental towers that can be seen from afar. It was said that when St. Petersburg was fully built, there were every summer season when the ice was melted and the season would begin, there was over 10,000 ships every year would sail in and out of St. Petersburg for the rest of the world. And another of the ship's offerings is to go to the Summer Palace, which is on the south of the city, and this was again a grand indulgence of Peter the Great, that he had his own private palace which features these tremendous fountains. They made a big irrigation water system so that these glorious big fountains would be always flowing, at least in the summertime. It was completely destroyed during World War II and has been completely rebuilt, including this great golden statue of Samson taming the lion, which to the Russians meant that they were fighting the Swedish lion. But it's a very beautiful place if you go there. We do have our 2 days, so we can go see quite a bit. This is the main palace downtown, the Winter Palace, and this was built after Peter the Great by Catherine I, and this was the extensive palace that remains to this day, with its rather humble entrances and minor family trinkets, including this great quadrata, the horseman up top. Now that's similar. We saw that in Berlin on the Brandenburg Gates, and it echoes the Piazza San Marco in Venice, but this is the triumph of the Russian Empire is expressed in these buildings. Now, Catherine I was a commoner from Latvia who became involved with Peter the Great when he was on his military campaign. She was much resented by the traditional, particularly the Russian Orthodox, because she was a Lutheran. How shocking. But she was a very wise woman and actually took control of the government after Peter died when her son was young. So she built a number of the most beautiful palaces, including her own Tsarkare, which is outside of the city, again, maybe about an hour out of town to the east. And this is another excursion where you can see, a modest country dacha here with it's a few quarters and a few rooms to wander around in. Again, this had been bombed in World War II and has been pretty much fixed up even fancier than it may have actually been, with its gilded domes and tremendous ornamentation. And sometimes we go there and have a dinner or a concert in that palace, depending on the program, and greeted by the Dixieland Jazz Band and the grand, almost Versailles kind of mirrored halls and parquet floors and beautiful paintings. And these are Dutch heaters. They have in the old days, they'd have a fire in there and the whole thing would get warm, and warm up the palace as much as you could at that time of the year. So there's dinner waiting for the Queen and her retinue in one of the small rooms. There are also big banquet halls, and a lot of details, like this clock on the ceiling, and most famously the Amber Room, which was a reception chamber that had all of its walls covered in this elaborately carved amber, which is a Baltic specialty of old pine trees that have been soaked in the seawater, and then they will extract the pitch, which is then hardened into amber. And this was the highlight of this palace. But in World War II, it was looted, and then it's been one of those mysteries, where did it go? And they never found it. They think it may have actually been destroyed in some other place in the terrible war there. And so a German energy company paid to have it restored. So now it's open to the public, and again, a national treasure. Well, just to view more the gardens and the pavilions, and this is a lovely summertime visit in the conservatory greenhouse. Well, it must have been fun to be an empress, but maybe not so much now. This is the successor, Catherine the Great, who was not related to Catherine the First, but was the wife of Peter the Second, her son. And she outlived her husband and then became the queen and had a reign of quite a few decades. Was a most dynamic woman. You can hear some tales about her, except that she was an equestrian, a military officer, an amateur scientist, and she continued Peter the Great's work to try to enlighten the Russian nation with compulsory education, the initial health care that they would provide to the poor, and a number of social programs that made her a popular queen. And she lived to a grand age and then was considered the mother of Mother Russia. And you can see in these portraits that she's has a kind of a twinkle in her eye. I'll leave it at that. And she's now memorialized all through St. Petersburg as the greatest queen of Russia. So here she is with Peter the Great and the god Zeus looking down smilingly on the prosperity and enlightenment that she continued to bring to Russia. But her greatest gift was she took part of the Winter Palace and made it the greatest art museum. She is the one who founded the Hermitage, which is mostly a collection of old masters and other European art. And so there's gallery after gallery through this grand palace, which are then now exhibition rooms, the grand staircase and the armory, and there's a great throne room there for her, and military monuments to the various leaders of the time, her grand entrance to the upper quarters. So it's one of the great reasons to go to St. Petersburg, just to see this great museum, which is very extensive. You can spend days and days in there. We'll have an early entrance there because it is literally swamped with even Russians coming to see the royal coach and all these things that are still there. Of course, you can also rent your own if you want to go for a ride around town. And you'll see impersonators of that royal era in the street. And so this is the pride of the past, but a great sight. And then from there, Russian history sort of devolves into the royal family being not just in opposition to their own people, but they became a very militarized force, and they kept these battles going on all over the empire. Nicholas I was, they said his main joy was to review the troops and send them off to slaughter. And so as the centuries went on, the Russian Empire actually expanded. Took Finland, took Poland, took the Caucasus, and now Kazakhstan and all that, and it was the initial expansion that led to the Soviet Union. And of course now it's smaller. But the royal family became more and more conservative, more and more religious, and they were, let's say, went against the grain of the future as represented by Peter the Great and Catherine the Great. And the disparity between the elaborately wealthy and all the poor was most apparent in St. Petersburg. There's an old saying that St. Petersburg is golden palaces in the front, mud shacks in the back, people feasting in the front, and other people starving. And so this led the great contrast in Russian society that led to the anarchists and then finally the communist revolution, Bolsheviks. Tsar Alexander III was blown up in his carriage. His death site was then commemorated with this great Church of the Blood in his honor, which is a very medieval style Orthodox church where his tomb is in there actually. Writers started to protest and describe things. Dostoevsky was arrested and put in the Peter and Paul fortress. And this is where the royalty ended up making its own demise because they were very repressive. They kind of closed Russia off from the changes that were happening in the rest of the world. The family was isolated. Now they had moved the capital back to Moscow, so they were in the Kremlin and away from St. Petersburg. And so the last Tsar, Nicholas II, sort of was almost a medieval ruler. And in St. Petersburg, you can go to the place where Rasputin was his advisor. But they were all, of course, overthrown by the revolution after many battles in the streets and uprisings. And finally, the Bolshevik Revolution and World War I was the demise of the royalty of St. Petersburg and Russia. So the World War I was the prelude to the even greater destruction of World War II, but it also led to a revolt in St. Petersburg of the Navy. The Aurora was the Navy ship that signaled the storming of the Winter Palace in 1917 that then led to the Bolshevik takeover of the country. But it was not until after a lot of fighting and a civil war that spread around all of Russia and even the north all the way to the south, including a little known fact, American troops were sent to Murmansk to attack the Red Army from the north, but they were driven back. The Russians remember. And then Lenin and his compatriots won. They gave their blood for the revolution and the people, etc. So this is coming up to our modern times where all of this old order and monarchy were thrown into the dustbin of history by the marching of the people. And many of the palaces and the churches especially were destroyed, and it was a program of the Soviet Union to eliminate religion. Now a lot of them are being rebuilt. But Russia was dragged into the present century by all of this action, and where it is still working on it, I'd say. But out of St. Petersburg came a kind of a cultural renaissance with a lot of modernism came from the artists and composers and people, writers. This is a Malevich painting, which is considered early Cubism from about 1900. A lot of literature. There's Anna Akhmatova, one of the great writers of the time. I'm going to say this painting of her is almost Cubist also. Diaghilev, the producer of the Ballet Russe, after the Bolsheviks sort of suppressed this libertine culture and elitist culture in St. Petersburg, many of them moved to Paris, where they were famous as producers of opera and dance and things. This is Igor Stravinsky and Diaghilev. Nijinsky was the great dancer. Also Borodin, Rimsky-Korsakov, and Tchaikovsky all came from St. Petersburg. So this has been a fountain of Russian culture right to this day. This is the Firebird, which caused such a sensation in Paris in about 1920. And of course the ballet goes on. The Kirov Ballet is based at the Nijinsky Theater in St. Petersburg, and you can go there and see their productions these days. So that's the pride of St. Petersburg to this day. During the revolutionary period, some things were never built, though there are sketches of this, for instance, the monument to the Third Communist International. And then the new czars took over. So Now this seems a long time ago, but it's pretty fresh because the Russians are still debating about whether Stalin or Khrushchev or whoever was the better leader at the time. Outside of central St. Petersburg, you have a lot of Soviet-era monuments, and especially to the siege of Leningrad, which went on for over 2 years in the winter with the Germans surrounding the city. Some 600,000 people died in the city, and the Russians refused to give in. And this is another indelible history for the people there today, because some people remember this. Now it's quite a while ago, except that the hardship of St. Petersburg was unprecedented in that terrible war. They were let's say, supplies kept coming over the frozen lakes of Lagoda onto the northeast of St. Petersburg to try to keep their bastion of freedom against the German army. And a lot of this is known in slogans and propaganda of the time. Here's an announcement for the patriotic concert of Shostakovich to try to encourage the Leningraders to St. Petersburgers not to give in and not to despair in spite of their hardship. So there's a museum right in the center city of the survival of the people and how they endured this siege and starvation. I mean, they actually reverted to the hospitals would take the dead and then they would dissect and then would send the human remains out to the market to sell as meat. It was that desperate. So there are monuments to this all through the, let's say, the newer part of town as the Great Patriotic War, and it's still celebrated as a example of the human spirit to survive, especially by this writer, poet Elena Chizova. And so now Russia doesn't have the communist symbol. This is the new Russian flag. That's my younger son there, wanting to be Russian. And outside of all this palaces, they've been trying to renovate and to make this a important city again. After the siege, it was very difficult to rebuild the destroyed outskirts and everything. And it's been led by this gentleman you may have heard of, who is a native of St. Petersburg. And so it's been surmised that perhaps they'll even want to move the capital back to St. Petersburg to be a more open place than Moscow. But I'll be negotiating with them when we get there. And so this is St. Petersburg on the river. It's quite a spectacular site all along the Neva. This is right off the fort, and the Russian Navy is right there. And it is, I said, the headquarters of the Russian Navy, and they're rebuilding that as we speak. But you'll see on Veterans Day and on Navy Day, all the World War II veterans come out all bedecked. This is the Navy flag, which could be confused for some others. But that's the Aurora, the revolutionary hero of the Navy back in the Revolution. And so this is part of the culture of St. Petersburg. It's very much a maritime place. And as we go in, we'll pass the main old Navy base on an island just outside of St. Petersburg, where they have a cathedral just for the Navy. This is called Kronstadt, the Royal Crown Island, it's called. And we pass that in and out. You'll get to see it one way or the other. It's now open to the public, though, as a historic site. As we come in, you'll see the old name, Leningrad. They did not change it for the harbor back to St. Petersburg. But we'll go into this modern container port, and then they have a cruise terminal. And then if you go downtown, I was there once, and the Navy was in town, let's say, and discipline was not as much as they might have to do on the ship. But summertime, the Russians, like other northern Europeans, go out and have fun while the sun is shining. So I'll just leave you this last views of the town, where it both has this medieval past, a kind of a Renaissance or an Enlightenment era part, and then all this modern commerce put on top of it, and globalization. And so St. Petersburg is still, let's say, a window to the world for the Russians, and they have a few dolls to sell you too. I like the Bart Simpson one. He's a traditional Russian mythology if I ever saw one. Anyway, it's a wonderful place. But another controversy lately, they're thinking of building incredible modern buildings. This is Gazprom, the great energy company, wanted to put up this symbolic flame in the city, and other ones for modern convenience centers and things. But the government decided to put that all outside of town and leave the palace and the traditional parts of town alone. not make St. Petersburg look like Dubai or something. But we'll see some of that. There's a big conference center outside of town that's just been finished, so there's a modern city too, which would be shocking to St. Petersburg that to Peter the Great, that his city would have led Russia into the modern era, and hopefully it will be a good one. I'll leave you with one last saying of Nikolai Gogol. He said, "On with the journey to Russia, to Russia. When I see you, my eyes are lit up with supernatural powers. Oh, what a glittering, wondrous infinity. What a strange, alluring, enthralling, and wonderful world. Russia." With that, I hope you have a great trip there, and I'll see you around the ship. Thank you very much.